Hello and welcome to What Would Jane Do? My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author and I adore Jane Austen and all that I can find out about her. And I am joined today by my regular podcast partner,
And partner in crime.
yeah, Kate McFarlane, who, amongst her knowledge in the era, spends a lot of time enjoying herself reenacting various Regency settings, balls, regimental outings, all sorts of things. And for those of you who are watching us on YouTube, you can see that Kate has dressed up for the occasion. Now, I was drawn to suggest this as a theme to Kate to discuss today, because first of all, by thinking how actually Jane Austen seems on the surface to have very little to do with crime at all. The world of her novels, you have to really dig deep to find anything approaching a crime, but there are what I would call huge what are looked at almost like crimes, huge moral failings. So that's what you see. People are judged and punished more on a moral scale than they are on a strictly criminal scale.
And you said that Jane Austen looks at human nature in quite a forensic way.
Yeah. So if you think about how everybody knows Pride and Prejudice. Basically, the structure of Pride and Prejudice is somewhat like a whodunit. Who is the good guy? Who is the bad guy? So there's and the judgment of Elizabeth and us as the reader, we're taken through the steps to find out the right answer to that question, which is very much like a whodunit novel, to be honest. I think part of its success as well as the romance. And that led me as an author to write a series for children called Jane Austen Investigates, which I wrote imagining Jane Austen at about 13, going about her world of Steventon, sort of investigating who was behind what crimes were happening locally, because I felt she would have the insight to the real motives of people in her
And if you
society.
read her juvenilia, she's very precocious in her language and her summing up of people as well. So
Yeah,
that makes perfect sense. And I know you keep saying they're for children, Julia, but I've enjoyed them as an adult because it's great fun spotting what you brought in from Jane Austen into that book to give younger audience a subtle hint as to the delights of Jane Austen to come.
they are full of Easter eggs
They are.
in that sense. And then the second take I have on it as an author is because I'm writing a series for adults, which are called, um, my publisher calls them Bridgerton meets the Da Vinci Code, uh, which I always struggle with, but it's kind of giving you the idea that they are Regency and they have a puzzle thriller.
Yes,
Are,
yes, they're very
you know,
entertaining.
there are somewhat a number of dead bodies that crop up in that as a result, in as you would expect. And the first one, the Persephone Code, ends with the assassination of Spencer Perceval, the British Prime Minister. That is not a plot spoiler, that is what happens in history. And it's a huge shock. It's the only time that a Prime Minister has been killed in whilst in office in that way.
Mm.
We haven't
And
had
it
them
could
sort
be
of.
a massive turnabout for the country if
Mm,
people were galvanized into acting because we still are not that far off from the French Revolution and about 40,000 aristocrats coming across the Channel. And there's always the potential with the inequality between rich and poor for enormous change to happen. So it must have been quite a scary time for everybody in England.
And it turned out when they investigated that it was more of a case of a lone wolf.
Mm,
So,
as it very often is.
yeah, I'm sure I know our American listeners will be all too horribly familiar with this.
Mm,
But it means that when I start the second book in the series, because it's all happening within a short period of time, I begin with the execution of the guilty party, Bellingham. So in the second book in the series, the Elgin conspiracy, we start with the hanging at Newgate Prison, which was only a week later, people. They were really quick about their justice. I think the only consolation we have is it's pretty clear he actually did the crime.
well, something at least.
Yes, at least he was guilty of the crime for which he was hanged, I should say. And it was because these were public executions, it meant that Lord Byron went to watch and present in the prison, just because he was there under libel. He'd upset the government, so he was in prison for what he'd written. is William Cobbett, who's a well-known writer and radical politician of the era. So crime and punishment was definitely a big theme in society. It was happening all over the place in terms of how society perceived themselves at the peak of Jane Austen's writing time in the early 1810s. But the odd thing is, when you turn to her novels, is how crimes you find. So let's just sketch in for those people who are listening who may not know much about the background to Jane Austen's world. What kind of crimes were going on? What did it look like, the landscape? We'll start with the army and that kind of world, because that's, I know, Kate's where you spend quite a lot of your time.
Yes, I hang out with the army on frequent occasions. And I was hanging out with the 33rd Foot at the Jane Austen Festival a few weekends ago. So that was very entertaining. I gave a talk on women in Wellington's army, and my husband Richard, who has appeared on this podcast before, gave a very well-received talk on duelling, with obviously a particular reference to Colonel Brandon and that scoundrel Willoughby. But that's for another podcast.
Well, yes, let's save dueling for a glorious
Yes.
duel on. But let's just put a marker down there. Dueling was illegal.
Yes, absolutely. And Richard makes some very pertinent points about what we imagine duels to be, thanks to literature and films that we've probably watched, and what the rules actually were, which were somewhat different to what you might imagine. But we can touch on that. But it was so in Bath, as many of you who visited probably know, there is somewhere called the dueling grounds, and these grounds are actually along the back of, I think it's Lime Walk, behind some houses in a very nice and in front of the Royal Crescent. So of course people would say, oh, we should go to the dueling grounds and have a duel. No, they wouldn't. Because it's totally illegal, and you could well, apart from being put in prison, you could certainly be asked to leave the country at the very least. So they wouldn't actually go to somewhere called the dueling grounds. They would go far away from the public eye and be very covert about what they were doing.
So we have dueling as an illegal activity, which was sort of socially acceptable for gentlemen. But let's park that, because we do want to look at that in greater depth. So there's our teaser about dueling. So, Kate, in the army itself, I think one of the first things to understand about Regency society is there isn't really the overarching law enforcement that we have.
No, in fact, I think the police, as we know them, there were starting to be organised police forces, but I think it wasn't until, I've got it written down here, the Metropolitan Police were really formed in about 1829, so well after Jane Austen's time.
We do have, just as a little, before we get people writing in. So yes, Robert Peel brought in the Metropolitan Police a bit later, but there was a river police.
Yes.
Oldest branch of the police force, and that was a lot to do with making sure that the shipping on the Thames was kept safe.
Protected, yes, absolutely, because as you can imagine, cargo on the Thames would be very easy pickings for certain people if you had a boat and a lot of hungry men. There was highway robbery going on, and that was only dying out about 1805, so it's still going on in Jane Austen's time. But with the growth of horse patrols, that died back and died a death eventually, because it was no longer it was never a safe thing to do, and plenty of highwaymen got killed very quickly and were expected to have a very short shelf life. But it certainly was prevalent in the years before that, until the advent of the roads becoming more populated, and they no longer had the isolated stretches like on Hampstead Heath, which was a bit notorious for highwaymen, with rich people going from London to their country estates. And it was most prevalent, obviously, around the bigger cities like London, Manchester, that sort of thing.
So this lack of a kind of organised police force meant that you would often find the adjudication of what were crimes happening in different sort of courts. We're still aware of military tribunals, but that would be the kind of thing that the I'm going to get the name wrong, 33rd Foot Regiment.
That's right, 33rd Regiment Foot, yeah.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing they would expect if, say, they were a derelict of duty or whatever. They would have
Mm.
the military officers would dish out the punishment.
Yes, I mean, as you can imagine, the army is made up of a lot of lower class people, and quite a few of them were law abiding in the sense of they came into the army because their normal trade was no longer available, like weavers. But there were a few people who'd possibly been given the army as an option instead of going to prison. So, as you can imagine, with a large part of the populace in the military at the time, or indeed the militia, you had to have very strong discipline. When you consider these people were basically being asked to stand still while being shot at about 100 yards distance, the discipline had to be incredibly ingrained so that you wouldn't think of disobeying your officer. So they had flogging a lot of the time. And the women who followed the army officially were equally flogged if they got out of line. So it was right across men and women. And interestingly, the person who flogged you wasn't your officer, it would be a musician who could actually be younger than you because they were a neutral body, if you like. They weren't part of the line. They were often stood at the side in battles. So flogging was pretty horrible. It could, yeah, certainly cripple you for a bit. But it was necessary to maintain absolute discipline. And I think at the time, however horrific we think of it today, because it was horrific, there was no doubt that the men understood it had to happen because if you got out of line, literally in the army, the consequences could be as severe as the entire line breaking and running. If you caused disruption, and again, the women were included in that, it could cause a riot. So one step up from like prison, you had to have quite severe discipline. That wasn't mean to doesn't mean to say that everybody was getting out of line all the time, but things could go very quickly, very wrong if you allowed an undisciplined rabble to yes get the bit between their teeth, especially after perhaps a battle, for example. So it was understood that once a battle had happened in earlier times, and everybody's blood was up, literally. There was occasionally, right back in earlier times, a condition where you actually cried havoc and let loose the dogs of war. They had it was like the purge, if anyone's ever heard of that. So basically, they had about a couple of hours to a day to go absolutely rampant all over a town, and then they were called back in. And if anything else happened after that, after they'd gone, you know, basically mad through a town, they'd had their chance to let off all the adrenaline in not very nice ways. But they would call them back in. Now, that didn't necessarily happen in Napoleonic times. They were more disciplined than that.
Well,
But it's interesting they had that originally.
there were incidents in the Peninsular War in Badajoz and
Mm.
places like that where this happened, and I think it shows the change of it being less accepted. And
Yeah,
how there was a pressure through Wellington and the officers to rein in those scenes of well, rape and pillage, basically. That
yeah, that's basically what happened. Yeah,
so the army is doing its punishment of its own, punishing its own, shall we say.
yeah, yeah.
Similar picture is happening in the Navy. We won't go into detail about that, but it's a very
No.
for similar reasons. But I think the important thing for Jane Austen fans is what we don't know and all her readers contemporarily knew is that all the characters who are involved in the army or the navy in some kind of position of leadership would accept it as part of their role to be acting as judge and judging the faults of others, or they
Mm.
themselves were under some form of military discipline. So
Absolutely. And if you think about it, again, most of the officers, lieutenants, captains were from the upper ranks of society. They had been born to rule. And I know that, again, that sounds, we have all sorts of issues with that today, but it was actually quite useful in terms of the lower orders of men. You didn't really have much of a middle class until Jane Austen's time. Um, they may not have appreciated it that much, but they would follow orders from these people because they were almost conditioned to do that themselves. But they had been, if you look at the film Master and Commander, there's some very young 12-year-old lieutenants there who are obviously being brought up to later on assume more of a command, but they are given command of men twice or more their age and expected to get on and give orders to them. And again, that seems totally weird to us today. But actually, they would have been used to giving orders to servants from a very young age and expected to maintain discipline, if you like, trained up in management skills. So they would have not accepted that, and the people under them would have accepted that. And as we've seen in the Sharp books, they were actually quite wary of someone who hadn't been brought up in that way, because what right has he got to be an officer? He's just like one of us. And also, it has to be said that in the army, the officers led from the front. It was never a case of lions led by donkeys. The officers were subject to similar discipline, and they were in the line of fire even more than the men were. So they were respected because of that.
So I think that this reminder that actually there's always going through, wherever you look with Crime and Punishment, there is a very strong story to be told about the class influence on it.
Yes,
And all
definitely.
you need to do is look at how crime was recorded. We're looking at a period when there weren't figures gathered because of the lack of a central police agency. But historians estimate, and we are talking just estimates, that 70% of crimes were property crimes.
Yes.
Those of you who have, seen your Oliver Twist, the pickpockets, you know that the majority of crimes that went through a magistrate's court were those of petty theft, but you could get very swingeing penalties for that. Um,
Mm.
Quite a relatively small amount value. It was done by the value of what you stole.
I
Could,
think I looked at
oh, have you got
that.
an actual figure? I think it's something like
Mm.
£5, but I might
You
be.
could be executed for stealing goods valued at more than a shilling.
Oh, well, that's nothing. A
Yeah.
shilling is a tiny amount, even in that day, kind of thing you
Mm.
might pay as a cab fare. Um, so there is an interest in those who have to protect what they have. Surprise, surprise.
Always.
And just on the other side is that they think about 10% of the sort of crimes that will get to court, because that's where we get the records, are for
Yeah.
violent crime.
Yeah.
So it
And of
could be
course, as
aggravated
there
theft.
was a lot of violence around. Yeah, very, very easily. Because people were desperate. There wasn't much holding them back in certain areas. There was violence erupted very quickly and very easily. And if you think of the disparity of wealth, I think it said the lowliest labourers earned between 12 and 25 pounds per year, while upper classes earned an income of 10,000 a year, like someone we know, or more. Today's disparity of wealth, I would say, is greater than it was at the time of the French Revolution. In
Yeah,
so
that's
much respect,
a
I
nice
know
thought.
it is.
Yeah.
But the English at the time were genuinely worried that we could have another French Revolution if we didn't put a stop to anybody getting out of a line very, very quickly. And there was the Industrial Revolution, which of course affected people's cottage industries. There were more people getting much closer together in the towns. And there were no-go areas in London. It was well known you didn't go into St Giles after dark, and the police just wouldn't go in there. They wouldn't even think of going in there. They would be patrolling the more well-to-do areas where people could pay for a police force, and they had a chance of at least stopping something.
Yes, and so we've got 75% property crime,
Mm.
10% violent. What's the other crime? Well, there will be things like fraud.
Mm.
Um, I have a relative who was transported for defrauding the Bank of England.
There
Um,
you go.
there you go. So things like that. He raided a trust fund to.
Mm.
Yeah,
And that was, well, if you think of how many stories, Julia, have you read about people's trust funds being spent
Mm.
or broken into. They were supposed to be obviously in trust, but the amount of people that spent their child's or their relatives' trust fund when they were supposed to be guarding it was probably quite high. Money
Yeah,
is always tempting.
and it was seen as a crime against the Bank of England, who was at the bottom of the trustee, as
Aha.
opposed to the person who the trust was in favor of.
Hmm.
And the other sort of area of crime, which perhaps it deserves its own, because this is a huge subject, but
Yes,
it
massive.
deserves its own podcast, is where you are writing libel, what is regarded as not acceptable political speech.
Would it be slander or not really?
It'd be libel in the case of
Libel,
written
yes.
down. Uh,
Yes, that's true.
but that's why William Cobbett was in prison,
Mm,
to be able to look out his window and see Bellingham get hanged. So
mm,
anyway, that's the kind of world we're in. And I'll just briefly, before we go to Jane Austen's novels, going to
mm.
dig and find the crime, which is um just to say what happened. So you were held in prison. If you were arrested, you were held in prison until the assizes. The assizes are like a sort of seasonal court thing, and trials were really quick. And
Can I read you a very small paragraph?
mm,
And this is from Eavesdropping on Jane Austen's England, which is a very interesting book, because it's about the assizes. And I found it interesting that assizes comes from sitting, which kind of makes sense if you break down the word, I suppose. Um, so it said if public disturbance could not be contained by the constables, magistrates could call for troops, but they might take some time to arrive. Magistrates, also known as justices of the peace, were the mainstay of the law. Appointed from among the large landowners of the area, they were unpaid and performed relatively mundane duties, such as the regulation of markets, fairs, alehouses, as well as judging and punishing minor offenders without a jury in petty sessions, later known as magistrates' courts. Those accused of more serious offences were tried at the quarter sessions held in towns and cities 4 times a year, where the justice of the peace presided in courts with a jury. The main criminal courts were the assizes, literally sittings, and judges moved from town to town within their circuit to hear serious cases like murder and counterfeiting. The assizes were usually held 2 or 3 times a year so that prisoners could wait months for their trial. In London, serious crimes were tried at the Old Bailey. And there's a lovely little passage saying of a local assizes being held in a county town as an event. So it said, we met the judges going to open the sessions with the same wigs and the same train as yesterday. So it was a spectacle for the whole town to look at. It says the whole town was in motion. The streets full of misses in white muslin, citizens in dark blue coats, carefully brushed, glossy hats and shining boots, and military people in red. It seemed a day of rejoicing. And in fact, the whole of the sessions is a period of amusement. Yet we learn that the prisoner here, prisons here are usually full. Uh, there are single cases of murder, and among them a young couple for beating their own child, an infant, to death. So it was a strange mixture of justice for horrible crimes, but also, like hangings, a spectacle. And it was quite common for people to go along as entertainment, like Byron did. Presumably, Byron also went to see justice done. Um, but it was a very strange combination of solemnity, but also spectacle.
so that wait to for the justice is one of the areas where Jane Austen's biography
Mm,
connects with the law, because her aunt was accused of stealing from a shop, and Cassandra and Jane were sort of, directed to go and keep her company while she was waiting for trial, which they were not very happy about.
mm.
I don't know if you're looking as though you're going to pull out something
Well,
about.
strangely, Julia, I have yet another
Tell us
quotation.
that.
Basically, it says exactly that. Mrs. Lee Perrow, there's always an argy-bargy about whether she actually stole the lace she was accused of stealing. Um, but there was a letter written to or Mrs. Austen, Jane's mother, basically wrote to say, "Would you like the girls to come and stay with you in your time of hardship?" And I think Mrs. Lee Perry was actually not in prison as such because she was a very well-to-do lady, so she could afford better treatment. But she wasn't very happy um, because she was staying in the prison warder's house, which was still probably far less than she was used to. Um, so it was quite rare for any members of the gentry in the upper classes to be tried for theft. They were much more likely to buy off the prosecutor before the case came to trial. And if that failed, they had much greater chances of being acquitted since they could afford to pay for a better lawyer or resort to bribery. So when Mrs. Jane Lee Perrot was arrested in August 1799 for stealing lace worth 20 shillings from Elizabeth Gregory's shop in Bath, she was refused bail, but instead of being held in the county jail at Ilchester, she was allowed to live with her husband in the adjacent prison keeper's house. As a letter written a few months later to Mrs. Lee Perrot from a cousin reveals, "You tell me that your good sister Austen has offered you one or both of her daughters continue with you during your stay at that vile place, but you decline the kind offer as you cannot procure them accommodation in the house with you," probably couldn't pay for it or didn't want to pay for it, "and you cannot let these elegant young women be your inmates in a prison, nor be subject to the inconveniences which you are obliged to put up with," probably far less than most prisoners. Two elegant young women, of course, were Jane Austen and Cassandra. But interestingly, after the trial, and she is acquitted, there's a lovely note from Jane Austen later on saying, "My aunt is in a great hurry to pay me for my cap, but cannot find it in her heart to give me good money. Instead, Jane was invited to accompany her to the Grand Sydney Garden breakfast. Polite society in Bath was already avoiding her aunt, and possibly for this reason, Jane declared, 'Such an offer I shall, of course, decline.' 2 days later, she added in her letter, 'My uncle and aunt drank tea with us last night, and in spite of my resolution to the contrary, I could not help putting forward to invite them again this evening. I thought it was of the first consequence to avoid anything that might seem a slight to them, but I shall be glad when it is over.'"
That's the closest we know, to Jane. She
Yes,
almost accompanied her aunt to prison, but didn't.
but didn't.
So after the trial, you will get your sentence. So there was a fair amount of capital crimes. That meant hanging at this era mainly. Very often the sentence was then commuted or changed into something else. And here we get the word transportation. Transportation is where you are sent abroad. It used to be to, in the 18th century, it used to be to America, was regarded as the place you were to be sent as an indentured servant. That obviously no longer is the case. Because America is no longer available. And a new place down in Australia, Botany
Down
Bay.
south. Yes, that was pretty harsh.
That started to be a prison colony from about the 1790s.
Yes.
There was some people who were given prison sentences with hard labor. So there was an element of that going on. But there was just not the same prison culture as we now have for crime.
No.
The one exception, which looks most like it, which is if you got in debt.
So there was debtor's prison. It was a whole separate thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, but you would find people there for a long period of time because they can't get out.
Well, people spent the rest of their lives there in some cases, and Charles Dickens later on writes very movingly of several characters being in debtor's prison, the Marshalsea, and almost making their lives there, I think in Little Dorrit, and in fact had experience of it himself when his father was arrested for debt. And I think his father basically sent Charles Dickens as a young boy to work off some of that debt in a factory.
In a blacking factory. Sticking labels on jars, which I don't think Dickens ever recovered from. But anyway, let's stay with Jane Austen. So we're going to look in Jane Austen's novels for evidence of crime. And we're also at the end, we're going to flip the tables and look at what was legal at her time, which is illegal now, and discover that she's got one very surprising but pertinent lesson for us today. So I was thinking through her crimes, no, her novels.
Yes.
I'm thinking there is very little, the occasional rumor of dangerous gypsies in the lanes. There was one element where the word crime is used, and that is in Mansfield Park,
Hmm.
where Mrs. Rushworth runs off with Henry Crawford, and that's called criminal conversation. But
Yes.
I just want to explain to the listeners that conversation is not actually a crime of adultery. That's that's not criminal. What
Hmm.
is criminal here is offence, a property crime. And the crime is a man has had intercourse with another man's wife who is his property.
Mm.
It's horrible, isn't it?
Well, I suppose it's a continuation of being a chattel, as
Exactly.
she was known as.
So when you see crim con, as it was sort of known in short,
Yes.
um, we're talking about something where Henry Crawford would go to jail, but he
Mm.
could well come out the worse for a lawsuit.
Mm.
Law lasts until 1857. And just to, I know I've been talking about my novel, The Elgin Conspiracy, but Lord Elgin, the historic Lord Elgin, had one of the most famous crim con
Yes, he did.
cases
Mm.
against the man. His what he divorces his wife, and she marries a man who was his best friend,
Mm.
and it was a huge deal in
Yeah,
the.
divorce at any level was really, really frowned on. It was a real disgrace. And Henry Crawford and is in disgrace. Mary Crawford tries to laugh it off and say they'll bring him back into fashion, but he has disgraced her and indeed by extension the family at Mansfield.
And of course, it's worse for the chattel. It's worse for the woman.
Henry Crawford goes on to, I think, have a political career and marry well. And Maria, who he had the adulterous affair with, is basically banished to the country with Mrs. Norris, which is almost as bad as being in prison.
Yeah, it is a kind of home, well, kind of home prison, isn't it?
Yes, pretty much.
Um, so I was thinking that other than knowing the people involved in the novels, they are the ones who are being magistrates in their life that doesn't come into the novel. That's the only time I my
What about Mr. Wickham running up enormous debt?
so there are debtors, that's true.
Hmm.
And they will try and solve their financial problems by marrying, which is also the case in Sense and Sensibility
Hmm.
with
With
uh
Willoughby.
Willoughby. W is not a
I
auspicious name.
know. She
I
loves her
said
W's.
Wentworth. She talked about with Wentworth. Um, so did you spot any other signs of crime?
Well, again, it's a lot of seducing and adultering. It's not a crime for Captain Tilney, General Tilney's son, to seduce semi-innocent. I would describe Isabella Thorpe. Um, she could possibly sue him for breach of promise, but I'm sure he never made any actual real promises to her. General Tilney throws Catherine Morland out into the cold effectively and puts her in danger, but again, it's not criminal. He's just treating your guests really, really badly. I was trying to think. There's nothing really in persuasion that I would call criminal. It's again how people treat each other, really. Although you could argue that the younger Elliot is trying to move in on his inheritance and again running up debts. So presenting himself as something he's not. Um, I think yes, I think it was mainly the, as you say, the crim con in Mansfield Park springs to mind for
I
that
have
one.
got one plot important crime that's come to
Yes.
mind, which is right at the end of Emma. The
Oh
fact that
yes.
the chicken houses have
The
been
chicken thieves.
yes, the reason why Emma's father decides that Mr.
It's all
Knightley can
right for Mr. Knightley to move in.
have a man around the house.
Yeah.
I think big, so where we've been going in this conversation is to point out that whilst Jane is surrounded by family members who are dealing out crime and punishment in their context, be it the Navy, be it
Mm.
locally, of course, there's a form of ecclesiastical penalties as
Yes.
well in the the
Church connections.
yeah. So there are she's surrounded by it. She has a narrow brush with it with her aunt.
Mm.
And also there's the bigger on the bigger scale, there's the Warren Hastings fraud big sort of House of Lords, wasn't it?
Yes.
Trial that went on, and Warren Hastings was the sponsor, possibly father of her cousin, who goes on to marry her brother. Oh, it's all very
It's
look
all
at the
very,
family tree.
yes,
It's all
exactly.
a bit close. Anyway, but actually, her novels are fairly like a golden glow of not being, and this is where, not being part of that world. And I think the answer to that isn't because she's avoiding it. It's because she's living in a society where, because the societies are small, when there are crimes, people pretty much know who's done it,
Who's done
or,
it? Yeah.
or who's the likely local person to do it.
Yes, absolutely. And I think people hark back to a time of village bobbies, knowing everybody. And they did. You would have a very small society that you moved in, shades of Mrs. Bennet. We dine with 24 and 20 families a week. But you would live in a fairly narrow society, even if you were poor, well, especially if you were poor. Places in Yorkshire, you just live in the same valley all your life. And you can tell because dialects are quite different from valley to valley. So that tells you how isolated communities were at that time and indeed later. So Jane's writing what she knows. Quite possibly women were fairly sheltered from all the sort of crime and punishment going on, although you would read about it in the newspapers and gossip about it. I've no doubt about that. But she was sticking with probably something that was a bit more interesting to her readers, which were affairs of the heart and how people's relationships impacted, and the crime and punishment aspect was probably less interesting to her. Possibly, you could argue that do her bad villains get punished particularly? Not in the legal sense,
No.
possibly by what happens to their hearts. Although I think Mr. Wickham gets off pretty lightly by being banished to an unfashionable regiment in the north, and Lydia is totally unrepentant for any hardship she may cause her family.
So it makes it interesting when you get continuations of her novels. I mean, I've done the ones sort of early on in life,
Mm.
and the crimes I've covered in that tend to be quite small. I thought the temperature of the crime would be somewhere on the property crime level. Though, of course, there are some things which we think are criminal, which weren't at the time, like slavery, for example,
Yeah, absolutely.
which form part of the narrative. But when you move on to the continuations, like in the P.D. James Death that Comes to Pemberley,
Comes to Pemberley. Mm.
suddenly the frame is wrenched and we get more extreme behavior. So the Colonel oh,
Fitzwilliam.
Fitzwilliam, thank you. In that is suddenly wrenched to being a different kind of character because you're in
Mm.
extreme behaviors. And
But
I
P.D. James is a crime writer, isn't she? So
exactly.
that's her métier, and she spends whole chapters on the court case for our villain.
So that's why I think, if you think that's what might have happened if you say, right, Jane's now going to write her prison book,
Yes, yes,
it would wrench her characters out of the where she felt she had something to say.
yeah, absolutely,
Okay,
yeah.
let's moving on here. Let's
Hmm.
do that flip. So, what was legal at the time, which is now illegal? So, the first place to go to is crimes against women.
Mm.
So, rape within marriage was not a crime.
Hmm.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So that's one big thing. Women have rights now, which they
So
wouldn't have
far,
done at the time.
yes. And it, for a very long time, still in some cases, in certain countries, women are seen as far secondary to their husbands, and indeed part of their husband's property. So it's more a crime against the husband than the wife that people are being punished for. But a tiny little historical thing that I like popping in historical tidbit. We get the phrase, you may as well be executed, you may as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb, was because they brought in at that time that you could be hung for both. So there's more meat on a sheep, so you may as well steal the entire sheep as steal the lamb. And the laws at the time, in the late 18th and early 19th century, were actually called the Bloody Code because of the number of offences that carried the death penalty, which is interesting. And they made more laws as the century went on, and it became a little bit fairer. But I think most of the time they were just saying, you know what, just execute them. This is property laws, and the upper classes particularly protecting their property.
So the other area, so we got the sort of property and women
Mm.
aspect. The other area which is now illegal is the way you chastise children,
Oh
which
yes.
these days would be called child abuse.
Mm.
So schools were famous for their flogging. Westminster School, Robert Southey, the poet, was part of a generation who protested against flogging. So it was awful, absolutely awful. You get quite a lot of this in Dickens if you want to sort of
Mm.
find out.
Oh
Um,
yes. Well, yes. Anything like what was it, Nicholas Nickleby was absolutely appalling.
yeah. And there was also very fuzzy legality about what you could do about putting away people who were mad within the family, but like
Yes.
um,
Now, that's an
people who
interesting
have
one.
been what you've thought of as promiscuous or taking
Or
the
if you just read a lot of novels, Julia, you
yeah.
could easily be put away for that.
Yeah, so that there was a whole set of penalties then, which we would regard now as exploitative and illegal.
Oh, absolutely.
Hunting, hunting with dogs,
Hunting. Oh,
now
right, now you mean.
illegal. Yeah, that might, I mean, our American listeners might not know, but hunting here with dogs, the old fox hunting, which you see on many a wall in pictures, is now illegal, famously so. It's a sort of ongoing.
Yes, people in Jane Austen's time would have been absolutely amazed
I think we're
that was
crazy.
made illegal.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have been able to fathom it.
I'm sure we could if we start, once you start connecting the dots, a lot of things pop up. But the last one that I'd like to mention is that I think some of the things which were sort of government led or officially led,
Hmm.
part of the colonial enterprise,
Hmm.
now seem very wrong. And
Oh, tons of things. The
I
more
will
you read
offer,
in history, the more appalled you get. Absolutely, wading into uh, cultures that they have no business wading into and just arbitrarily changing whole lives and ways of doing things.
and I will offer as evidence for the prosecution here my favourite Lord Elgin,
Of course.
whose actions continue to be a massive scandal
To this
between
day, repercussions.
England or British Museum, I should say,
Mm.
and the Greek authorities, because what happened there is that he got permission of a sort from the ruler,
Powers that be at the time.
yes, who were actually in Constantinople. So they were
Yes.
the Grand Port or the Portland. Um, and he went and looked at the Parthenon marbles, thought, oh, they're going to get destroyed if I don't take them. I better look after them. Uh-huh. And he took them home. And now they're in the British Museum. So it was legal, sort of, semi-legal, not
Yeah. Yeah.
illegal. Everyone was doing it. So
About as legal as they ever did.
yeah,
Yes.
Napoleon was going around Europe hoovering
Oh,
up.
yes.
So nobody really, well, not nobody, Byron worried about it. But
Yeah.
it wasn't on the basis of whether it was illegal or not. It was more as on the case of should it
Moral or
be
not.
done or
Yes.
not.
Yeah.
Particularly as Greece was the cradle of civilization. So
Hmm.
there we go. Collecting in that kind of taking everybody's stuff way. Funny how you can steal a handkerchief off a gentleman on, you
Or a
know,
pocket watch.
on Oxford Street and be hung for it. But if you go to Greece and nick the
Well,
Parthenon
I think
marbles,
as so often, Julia, it's that if you are powerful enough to commit enormous crimes of enormous size, the sheer size of it kind of puts you beyond the pale, and you are beyond justice. And I think, like Mrs. Lee Perrow, you can buy your way out of it, or at least sort of blag your way out of it. I'm above such things.
yeah, I will leave everybody to find their own contemporary interpretation of that. And I just wanted to say there's one thing that when I was reading about around this for our chat, and I told you I was going to land here, which is, I think Jane Austen has a very relevant lesson for us in our contemporary setting about crime and punishment. And that is about our idea of investigating crimes ourselves. Those sort of true crime podcasters who rush into places where there seems to be a mystery and try and solve it themselves. Because, of course, the reason why Jane Austen isn't doing crimes in her novels is because that is the world of the Gothic novel.
Yes.
And
they are very much fantastical crimes.
yes,
There's all sorts of horrific things that go on, but there's definitely an element of fantasy to kind of distance us from your ordinary crime of violence.
but they are not, obviously they're banditti and Italianate castles and things which make it feel
Monks
distant.
who
But
ought to be moral.
actually, what you're talking about there is somebody doing away with their wife or whatever. It's actually
Inconvenient relative.
the classic true crime podcast material.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And Catherine Morland, poor thing, poor little soul, who's been reading so many things, she whips herself up into a state of belief. She believes her own conspiracy theory, as we would put it. And she only realizes how far she's gone when Henry Tilney kind of puts daylight on it. And I just want to read you this speech. So this
yes,
is Jane
it is
Austen
quite
telling us
severe on her.
Yes, it's Jane Austen telling us not to get ourselves whipped up into.
No, I think I can never read this without feeling slightly ashamed myself.
Okay, so everyone get ready to feel shame. If I understand you rightly, you have formed a surmise of such horror as I have hardly words to. Dear Miss Morland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you have entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember the country and the age in which we live. Remember that we are English, that we are Christians. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighbourhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dear Miss Morland, and dear listener, what ideas have you been admitting? And I think, with Henry's reprimand there, we now need to go and run off and cry in our rooms, as Catherine did. Anyway, so thank you, Kate, for doing a canter through Crime and Punishment with me.
You're more than welcome. It's always a pleasure. My very quick Jane Austen news.
Yes, please.
Is as many of us have probably already known. There's a 10-part series called The Other Bennet Sister about Mary Bennet, announced by the BBC recently. No release dates yet. They probably haven't started filming. But it's based on the novel by Janice Hadlow, and I'm definitely looking forward to this because they've described it as a true underdog story about Mary Bennet finding herself from Meryton to the Lake District to the soirees in London. So I can't wait to see what they do with it.
It's a fabulous novel, so do read it if you haven't had a chance to read it before they give it the old TV treatment. I also was going to ask you for your Lady Catherine and your Elizabeth week, or your Darcy and Wickham, perhaps.
My Lizzie Bennet, if you like, of the week is Caroline Jane Knight, our perennial favourite on this podcast. Jane Austen's great niece. She would like us, the gentle reader, to nominate Chawton House, or Chawton House Library in particular, for a charitable grant award of up to £5,000. I will send you the link for that. You can just basically nominate them, and they will be put into a drawer for possible money to support the Chawton Library, which would be great.
Fabulous.
And I think my Mr. Wickham, because we're talking about powerful people escaping things, has to be Elon Musk, who was trying to garner sympathy, which is in short supply for billionaires, by saying, I paid 11 billion in tax last year, so you should feel, I'm doing my bit. And somebody responded, yes, that's 4.5% of your actual income. You didn't pay any tax the year before that. Most of us pay between 20 or 30%, so do better.
Yeah, and he's quite a good one. I haven't chosen him before, I don't think. But I
Like
wasn't
Mr.
very,
Collins with lots and lots of money.
I wasn't impressed by him trying to stoke civil war in our country.
Yes.
Summer, which he did, gentle reader. Got to America, but we had some horrible crimes committed here, which he
Mm,
stoked the backlash,
mm.
and it was not good. So yeah,
No.
definitely Mr. Wickham. I think my Mr. Darcy must be all those people, because we're in a period of election in America when we're recording this.
Yes.
I'm not going to pick a candidate, but all those people who are trying to hold the politicians to the truth in
Yes.
a time when people seem to think alternative facts are fine. They're
Yes.
not fine. So people, I watch quite a lot of, I listen to podcasts and watch quite a lot of American news just out of interest.
Hmm.
So people like Rachel Maddow and Catty Kay and other, well, there are lots of wonderful women. There you go. Are my heroes. And it's not so much their political beliefs, it's to do with the fact that they want to keep to truth.
Yes. Which in politics is a very difficult thing to do, but good on them for trying.
Yeah. Right. Well, we're probably going to next talk about dueling by the sounds of it. So we will meet at Pistols at dawn.
At dawn.
You and I, yes. And we'll settle our disputes in the way that only a gentleman can do. So until
Ah, but
then,
did you know that women duelled as well, Julia? We'll
oh,
go into that.
gentlewomen, us gentlemen. So we will report back on our duel in
I'll
our
find my second.
in our next What Would Jane Do? Thank you for listening.